Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. For tonight's game, the PWP team is playing some of their new favorites as well as testing how a budget deck fares against some of the full-powered budgetless decks in this format. This episode was made possible by all of our supporters on Patreon. Our Patreon offers tons of benefits, including Discord access, behind-the-scenes footage, raw gameplay, additional gameplay series, merchandise discounts, and archive footage of old games as well. We have tiers at all budgets, so sign up today. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Ryan, piloting Urza, Lord High Artificer. This is a mid-range list that uses polymorph and similar effects to cheat a Tidespout Tyrant into play. With Tyrant in play, you can make infinite mana and cast your deck with Urza for the win. His opening hand contains a Narset's Reversal, Transmute Artifact, Static Orb, Swan Song, Intuition, and 2 snow-covered islands. Next, we have Zach, piloting his budget version of Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow. This is a tempo list that looks to interact heavily while triggering Yuriko each turn to draw cards and drain out your opponents. His opening hand contains a Command Tower, Moth Dust Changeling, Liliana's Triumph, Treasure Cruise, 2 islands, and a Village Rites. After that, we have Mike, piloting Korvold, Fey Cursed King. This is a blazing fast combo deck called Korvold Treasure Storm. It uses the synergy between treasures and Korvold to make mana, draw cards, and eventually assemble a win. His opening hand contains an Overgrown Tomb, Deflecting Swat, Abrupt Decay, Felwar Stone, Dockside Extortionist, Mana Crypt, and his London Mulligan is a Summoner's Pact. Finally, we have Folger, piloting Najeela, the Blade Blossom. This is a mid-range list that looks to establish Najeela, interact heavily, and win using Najeela and an army of warriors. His opening hand contains a Force of Vigor, Arbor Elf, Birds of Paradise, Deathrite Shaman, Brainstorm, Watery Grave, and a Flooded Strand. Without further ado, let's begin this obnoxious, odd, omniscient, optimal, outspoken ocean of ogres. Ryan won a $1 million lottery and was able to buy 2 reserve list cards and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a snow-covered island. He passes the turn. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Moth Dust Changeling. He ends the turn. Mike draws a card for turn and plays an Overgrown Tomb, untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Felwar Stone. He ships the turn to Folger. Folger draws a card for turn and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Birds of Paradise and passes. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered island. He passes to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Moth Dust Changeling. Mike declares no blocks. Zach activates his commander's ninjutsu ability and puts Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow, onto the battlefield, returning Moth Dust Changeling to his hand. Mike takes a hit and Yuriko triggers. Zach reveals a Baron Moor and puts it into his hand. He passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike casts Tainted Pact. In response, Folger casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card and targeting Mana Crypt and Felwar Stone. Force resolves and destroys the artifacts, and then Mike's Pact resolves. He exiles until he reveals a Windswept Heath and puts it into his hand. Zach discards the hand size, and then the turn passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts an Arcane Signet and ends his turn. Folger draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes, and the table is very suspicious about his hand. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Yuriko. Mike takes it and Yuriko triggers. Zach reveals a Thieves Guild Enforcer into his hand and each of his opponents lose 1 life. In his second main phase, Zach plays an island. He casts a Moth Dust Changeling and passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Spire Garden. He ends the turn. Folger draws and starts off by paying 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Ryan. In response, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. He casts an Intuition. He fetches up a Mystic Remora, Mana Crypt, and a Soul Ring. Folger chooses to give Ryan the Mystic Remora, and Ryan puts the other 2 into the graveyard. Finally getting to see what Ryan kept, Folger looks at Ryan's hand and then draws a card. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Folger moves to combat, and before attackers, Mike casts an Abrupt Decay, targeting Najeela. In response, Folger casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Decay resolves, and Najeela is destroyed. In his second main phase, Folger cracks Jeweled Lotus and recasts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Mystic Remora and passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach flashes in a Thieves Guild Enforcer. It enters and each of his opponents mills 2. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Guild Enforcer and Mike with Yuriko and the Changeling. Both take the hit and Yuriko triggers twice. Zach maintains priority and casts Brainstorm. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. In response, Ryan casts Swan Song, targeting Brainstorm. Swan Song counters Brainstorm and Zach creates a 2/2 bird. Yuriko's triggers resolve and Zach reveals an Unsubstantiate into his hand and his opponents lose 2 life. He then reveals a Thought Scour, puts it into his hand, and his opponents lose 1 life. In his second main phase, Zach plays an island and ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Talisman of Dominance. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. Mike passes to Folger. Folger draws and plays a Godless Shrine, untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Folger creates a warrior, tapped and attacking Mike. After blockers, Folger activates Najeela. Mike takes a hit and Folger gains 4 life. In his second combat step, Folger attacks Mike again with Najeela and his warrior. Najeela triggers and Folger creates 2 warriors tapped and attacking Mike. Mike takes it again and Folger gains 4 more life. He passes. At the end of Folger's turn, Ryan cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Ryan chooses not to pay for his Remora and sacrifices it. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He casts his commander, Urza, Lord High Artificer. Urza enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Zach casts a Liliana's Triumph. Folger sacrifices a warrior, and Ryan sacrifices Urza. Urza's trigger resolves, and Ryan creates a construct. He casts a Mishra's Bauble. He casts a Personal Tutor. He fetches up a Polymorph onto the top of his library. Ryan ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts Thought Scour, targeting Ryan. Ryan, completely forgetting that Zach revealed that earlier, sighs and it resolves. Ryan mills 2, including his Polymorph, and Zach draws a card. The turn then passes to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with everything. Folger takes it and Yuriko triggers twice. Zach reveals a swamp and puts it into his hand. He reveals an island and puts it into his hand. In his second main phase, Zach plays a swamp. He casts a Looter Ilkor and ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and in response, Ryan cracks his Mishra's Bauble. He looks at the top card of Zach's library. Mike then creates a treasure. He casts a Mox Opal and passes. During Folger's upkeep, Ryan draws a card through Mishra's Bauble. Folger draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He moves to combat. Before attackers, Zach casts an Unsubstantiate, targeting Najeela. Folger responds by casting Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Unsubstantiate. Flusterstorm counters Unsubstantiate, and Folger attacks Zach with Najeela and 2 warriors. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 3 warriors tapped and attacking Zach. Before damage, Folger activates Najeela, tapping Forbidden Orchard and giving Ryan a spirit. Zach takes the hit, and Folger gains 8 life. In his second combat, Folger attacks Zach with Najeela and 5 warriors. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 6 more warriors tapped and attacking Zach. Zach takes the hit again, and Folger gains another 8. Folger then ends his turn, passing to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts a Witching Well. It enters, and Ryan scries 2. He casts Static Orb. He passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts a Village Rites, sacrificing Thieves Guild Enforcer and drawing 2 cards. Zach untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Looter Ilkor. Folger takes the hit, and Looter triggers. Zach draws a card and discards. In his second main phase, he plays a Tainted Isle. He casts a Memnite. He delves away some of his graveyard to help cast Treasure Cruise. Zach draws 3 cards and passes the turn, discarding the hand size. Mike untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Korvold, Fake Curse King. It enters, and Mike sacrifices Talisman of Indulgence. Korvold triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Mike draws a card. Mike cracks his treasure for a black. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He then passes to Folger. Folger untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws, takes no game actions, and ends the turn. Ryan untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws, also takes no game actions, and passes. Zach untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Yuriko and his Changeling. Folger takes it, and Yuriko triggers twice. Zach reveals a Soothsaying into his hand, and his opponents lose 1. He reveals an Exotic Orchard into his hand. During his second main phase, Zach plays Exotic Orchard. He passes, discarding the hand size. Mike untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Korvold. Korvold triggers, Mike sacrifices Mox Opal, Korvold gets a counter, and Mike draws a card. Folger takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike plays a Badlands. He casts a Viscera Seer and ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Folger casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Ryan casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Vampiric Tutor. Zach responds by casting Negate, targeting Vampiric Tutor as well. Negate counters the tutor and Narset's reversal fizzles. The turn then passes to Folger. Folger untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and casts a Diabolic Intent, sacrificing a warrior as an additional cost. He fetches up a card into his hand and passes the turn. Ryan untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He ends the turn. Zach untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Yuriko. Folger takes the hit and Yuriko triggers. Zach reveals a phantasmal image into his hand and his opponents lose 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach plays an island. He casts a phantasmal image. In response, Mike, having a pretty good idea of what he's trying to copy, sacrifices Dockside Extortionist to Viscera Seer. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws a card. He scries 1 and then Phantasmal Image resolves, entering as a copy of Korvold, Fey Cursed King. Korvold triggers, Zach sacrifices an island and puts a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draws a card. He passes to Mike. Mike untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and casts a Dark Ritual. He makes 3 black and then uses it to cast Necromancy. It enters and Mike returns Dockside to the battlefield. It triggers and Mike creates 4 treasures. He cracks a treasure for a black. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws a card. He casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Zach casts Submerge, targeting Korvold. Mike responds by casting Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Submerge. In response, Folger casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card and targeting Swat. Force counters and exiles Swat, and with Submerge still on the stack, Mike responds. He cracks another treasure for a black. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He cracks a treasure for a red. Korvold triggers again, gets a counter, and Mike draws a card. He sacrifices Dockside Extortionist to Viscera Seer. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He scries 1 and cracks his last treasure for a green. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He sacrifices Korvold to Viscera Seer. Korvold triggers, and Mike draws. He scries 1 and then Submerge fizzles. Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Mike fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He casts a Jessica's Will, targeting Zach. Mike makes 6 red mana and then casts Culling Ritual. The table groans and begins to count. This will make 21 mana and then has to be stopped. Fortunately, Ryan is prepared and casts Force of Will, exiling a blue card, paying a life, and targeting Culling Ritual. Force counters Ritual, and Mike follows it up by casting Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then casts Underworld Breach. In response, Ryan comes in clutch again and casts Pact of Negation, targeting Underworld Breach. Pact counters Breach, and Mike casts a Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Marsh Flats, finally has to end his turn, and passes. Folger untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws, holds open mana, and ends the turn. Ryan untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. During his upkeep, Ryan pays for his Pact of Negation trigger. He draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Folger with Yuriko and Korvold. Korvold triggers, Zach sacrifices an island, puts a counter on Korvold, and draws a card. Folger takes the hit and Yuriko triggers. He reveals a Drown in the Loch into his hand and his opponents lose 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach plays an island. He ends the turn, discarding to hand size. Mike untaps 2 permanents through Static Orb. He draws and adds 6 red mana through Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Wooded Foothills. He recasts his commander, Korvold, Fey Cursed King. It enters and Mike sacrifices Arcane Signet. Korvold triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Mike draws a card. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, paying a life. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield, and then passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Folger casts Abrupt Decay, targeting Static Orb. In response, Zach casts Drown in the Loch, targeting Najeela. Najeela bites the dust, and then Abrupt Decay destroys Static Orb. Still during the end step, Folger casts an Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Soul Ring onto the top of his library, and then the turn moves to Folger. Folger draws and casts Soul Ring. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Ryan a spirit to recast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He moves to combat, and in response, Mike cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield, tapped. He sacrifices Viscera Seer to itself. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Mike draws. He does not find an answer, scries 1, and then passes priority. Folger attacks Mike with 7 warriors. Najeela triggers, and Folger creates 7 more warriors, 4 tapped and attacking Mike, and 3 tapped and attacking Zach. Mike blocks one of the warriors, and then Mike and Zach take the rest. Mike dies, and Folger passes the turn. At the end of Folger's turn, Ryan cracks his Prismatic Vista, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Ryan draws and plays a Mystic Sanctuary untapped. Sanctuary triggers, and Ryan returns Polymorph from his graveyard to the top of his library. He recasts his commander, Urza, Lord High Artificer. Urza enters and Ryan creates another construct. He casts a Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 6. Ryan ends the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts Op. He scries 1 and draws. Zach draws and taps Midnight to give Moth Dust Changeling flying. He moves to combat and attacks Folger with Looter, Korvold, and Changeling. Korvold triggers and Zach sacrifices Midnight. He puts a counter on Korvold and draws a card. Folger takes a hit and Yuriko and Looter trigger. Zach draws and discards. He reveals Winds of Rebuke through Yuriko, puts it into his hand, and his opponents lose 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach casts a Ghostly Pilferer. He plays an island and then passes. Folger draws and casts Silence. In response, Zach delves away some of his graveyard to cast Murderous Cut, targeting Najeela. Folger responds by casting Veil of Summer. Zach has the answer again and casts Abjure, sacrificing Looter Il Core as an additional cost, targeting Veil of Summer. Korvold triggers, which is really basically just good deck building. It gets a counter and Zach draws a card. Abjure resolves and counters Veil, Cut resolves and kills Najeela, and then Silence resolves. Folger casts a Noble Hierarch. He casts a Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control with Yuriko. Folger ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Vault. He cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. He delves away some of his graveyard to cast Dig Through Time. He looks at the top 7 and puts 2 into his hand. He casts a Polymorph, targeting his construct. In response, Zach casts Winds of Rebuke, targeting that same construct. Ryan responds by casting Counterspell, targeting Rebuke. Zach responds by casting his own Counterspell, targeting Counterspell. Ryan groans and puts Send It onto the stack, and by Send It I mean he activates Urza. He shuffles his library and then reveals the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. Unfortunately, he has already played his land for turn and doesn't get the value of destroying Zach and Folger's boards with Tabernacle. Zach's Counterspell counters Ryan's Counterspell, Winds of Rebuke bounces the construct, each player mills 2 cards, and then Polymorph fizzles. Ryan begrudgingly passes to Zach. Zach draws and casts CEDH staple, Conkhorn. He taps Pilferer to give Moth Dust flying. He moves to combat and attacks Folger with Korvold and Gilded Drake, and Ryan with Changeling and the Bird. Korvold triggers, and in response, Folger taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Ryan another spirit to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Korvold. Phantasmal Image's ability then triggers. With it on the stack, Zach cracks his Conkhorn. Korvold triggers, gets a counter, and Zach draws. He then draws 2 and puts 1 back on top through Conkhorn. Fimige's trigger resolves and sacks itself. Korvold's trigger resolves, and then Zach sacks an island. Neither Folger or Ryan block, and after blockers, Zach ninjutsu Zen Ninja of the Deep Hours, returning Moth Dust Changeling to his hand. Ryan and Folger take the hit, and Ninja of the Deep Hours triggers. Zach draws a card, and in his second main phase, he plays a Sunken Hollow. He casts a Dream Cache. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He passes the turn. Folger draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He recasts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Ghostly Pilferer triggers, and Zach draws. Najeela resolves, and Folger moves to combat. He does some combat math and has 2 options. The first, full swing out at both Zach and Ryan. If his newly acquired Yuriko hits a 4 CMC spell or higher, he wins. The problem is, there are only 2 4 mana value or higher spells left in his library. The second is to kill Zach, hold back blockers, and then put Ryan on a 1-turn clock to either win the game or answer his overwhelming board state. If you were Folger in this situation, what would you do? Let us know in the comments below. Folger decides to attack Zach with 12 warriors and Yuriko. Najeela triggers and creates 12 warriors, 2 tapped and attacking Zach, and the other 10 tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan blocks 4 warriors with Urza and his 3 spirit tokens. Ryan takes a rest, and Zach dies. Yuriko triggers, and Folger reveals a Force of Will, putting it into his hand. Ryan then loses 5. Folger passes to Ryan with interaction up and hopes for the best. During Ryan's draw step, he takes a damage from his mana vault. He loves, and I mean loves, what he just drew. He casts a Merchant Scroll. He fetches up a Flusterstorm into his hand and then casts the card he drew for turn, Proteus Staff. Folger sees the writing on the wall and lets it resolve. Ryan activates Staff, targeting his construct. He flips through his library until he reveals a Tidespout Tyrant and puts it onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Opal. Tidespout Tyrant triggers and targets Witching Well. Folger responds by casting Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, and targeting Mox Opal. In response, Ryan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Force. Force is countered, and then Ryan returns Witching Well to his hand. He presents a loop of casting Witching Well, tapping and then bouncing Mox Opal to his hand, recasting Mox Opal, tapping and bouncing Witching Well to his hand to produce infinite mana. He is then able to activate Urza a whole bunch of times and cast spells, bouncing one of Folger's permanents each time he casts a spell. When he runs out of spells to help bounce permanents, he casts Time Twister, holds priority, and casts Narset's Reversal. Time Twister is copied and returned to Ryan's hand. He then shuffles his hand, which contains Time Twister, and his graveyard into his library and draws a fresh 7. Using this Time Twister loop, Ryan is able to repeatedly cast all spells in his library. He uses this loop to bounce the rest of Folger's permanents. He then uses Tidespout Tyrant to bounce and recast Urza, creating infinite constructs that are infinitely large. He passes the turn to Folger, who has no board state, and Folger concedes the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a game! Congrats to Ryan on his come-from-behind victory. He did a great job of sticking in the game and was rewarded with his final top deck. Special mention of all the 6 synergy in Mike's deck with Korvold. The table allowed Mike the smallest of windows, and he capitalized on it. He could only then be stopped by triple free interaction from Ryan and Folger. Folger had victory in his sights, but came up just short. All in all, each player displayed the full range of what their decks are capable of. Zach in particular showed that even on a budget, this deck can still battle at a CEDH table. The most valuable card in tonight's game goes to Korvold, Fake-Cursed King. With 2 Korvolds in play for tonight's game, he was on full display. The raw card advantage and terrifying threat he provides is amazing. Even without building around him, Zach was able to generate lots of value. However, it was Mike who really showed what this commander is capable of. Dockside Extortionist is already a fantastic card in this format, but paired with Korvold, it becomes a non-stop value train. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. It is Patreon shoutout time. I'd like to give a shout out to Nathan Smith, Elijah Miller, J-Rock, Pyro, Dark, Philip Hickey, Brad Tobin, Sanguina Lindsay, Snarps the Klept, Matt Wingrove, Delph Driz, Dante, Jared Smith, Baby Jeebus, Rakeko, Greg Babe, Zods, Wayan, Spielrahu, Sparks, CZ, and Nick. Thank you all very much.